All right, welcome, folks, to a panel discussion and a group discussion, we hope, on the subject of diversity broadly, and especially we hope to link with our own sector and our organizations. We have a wonderful group of folks gathered to guide us in that discussion, who themselves together define at least some aspects of diversity, because they have diverse life experiences and approaches and perspectives and special interests and knowledge. The way we're going to operate the session, it's not stunningly creative. It's I introduce these folks, each have a bit of a spiel, and we want to ask you to keep in mind, as an individual, of course, when we're speaking about issues of diversity, there is an element of kind of moral imperative. We think there's more. There's also an enriching, we want to enrich our organizations and our own lives and our province with recognition and respect for and a celebration of difference and diversity. But we want to think strategically about ways that we, in our organizations and in our own lives, we question ourselves about what are we doing, how do we operate, what are the implications, and how can we build a better place in Nova Scotia. So I think I'm just going to leave, I had a little introduction about the topic that I think I'll leave behind, and I just want to turn right away to our panelists. We have about 75 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes together. So I'm very pleased. I'm going to do real brief introductions. I'm going to start with Yvonne Atwell, who is well known in Nova Scotia as a community builder, and with a special interest and experience in the African Nova Scotian community and in building bridges, perhaps, and using them. But I'll leave that to whether those are the metaphors you want to use, Yvonne. Yvonne is currently working with the Community Justice Society. Executive Director, perhaps? Okay, another ED in the room. So thank you very much, Yvonne, for taking time to be with us today. Jerry Mills is with ISIS and Director of Operations. Okay, and Jerry, well, ISIS itself has an interesting history and presence in Nova Scotia, but during our most recent interaction was during the One Nova Scotia Commission, the Ivany Commission. We had a really interesting, we kind of co-organized an interesting event of that had a large room full of mostly metro-based new Nova Scotians and immigrants, and talked about contributions to the economy and some barriers there. So thank you, Jerry. Roger Hunka, have I got the pronunciation? Okay. Right, pretty well, good enough. Okay.
Just like hunk of burger, hunk of love.
Hunk of love, okay. Well, I know just from the lunchtime conversation that we just had, I mean, we almost canceled the panel because we covered so much at lunchtime. We thought, well, it's been done now, but unfortunately we didn't record it. But I know that Roger has deep passion and deep views around pluralism and around the subject of diversity, and his work experience has been primarily with First Nations groups in various parts of Canada, unceded land, and current work position is with the Aboriginal Peoples Congress. Is that correct?
Maritime Aboriginal Peoples Council.
Maritime Aboriginal Peoples Council. I almost got that right. Lori, last name is Suter. Okay, Lori Suter, some of you, I hope, are in the room who had the privilege of being in the workshop yesterday morning, and I thought really practical ideas around reaching out and accepting and being welcoming and inclusion and cross-cultural relationships. And the metaphor of the bridge will come up, I believe.
I promise.
And okay, in Lori's discussion. I thought some great points there. Now, Lori, you have had and continue to have such a diverse work experience. Could you give us one title of who you are now, what entity what organization you work with?
Probably not. I work where I'm needed.
She works where she's needed. Very good. Okay. Okay, like an amoeba. Oh, that was yesterday. Okay. Dr. David Haas. I'm really pleased to have met David. We go back, maybe 10, 15 minutes. And in that time, I've already realized that this is a man with a wonderful spirit. And so I'm really pleased to have met David. And David right now works with, I'll hold up the brochure, the Health Association of African Canadians. But I'm also told, when I put the question out to my fellow panelists, and David wasn't at the table, what can I say about this guy? And then things started to come out, and some of them I just can't say, but very, very much about the wonderful, best possible physician in the sense of valuing people and being what we need for true healing in the work that he's done as a doctor. So great to have you. David has stepped in for it's Marie-Claude Rioux, who is with La Fan, and unfortunately couldn't make our panel today. But I want to mention that La Fan has been such an exemplar in the community sector for some of its initiatives, very entrepreneurial in not the sense of profit seeking, but really value making through innovative structures of collaborative shared services in the way they've done things in their organization. So that's the Federation, the Acadian Federation. So it's unfortunate they're not with us today. I'm hoping there's someone who can perhaps bring some experience and understanding and perspective from the Acadian community in our room today. So I'm going to hand the mic over. We did not choose a facilitating question, how can we be more diverse or whatever. I'm just going to ask each of the folks here to speak a little bit about their work and their experiences. I'm going to ask, if you can, to think of some successes within the community sector organizations and nonprofits, and something you can think of that's encouraging that we could try to amplify in terms of increased diversity, and just whatever you would like to speak to on the subject. So I'm going to start randomly at Terry. Is that okay? And we'll go.
Yes, I'm fine, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm really pleased to be talking about this subject. Where we jump in, where ISIS jumps in, is very interesting, I think. We are a not-for-profit organization, but we have 120 staff, so we would be kind of at the higher end in terms of number. But we're community-based. We have a strength-based approach, frontline service delivery for immigrants across the province. So even though it's a large organization, we really haven't forgotten our values and our approach. So where do we jump in? Well, when you talk about diversity, you can talk about all sorts of different things, age and abilities. Where I'm going to jump in, of course, is around ethnicity and culture. So just to give you a brief overview of what ISIS staff looks like, 60% are immigrants from 45 countries, 60 languages. We have African Nova Scotian. We have we did have a First Nation person who's just recently left. I asked one of our staff, can you tell me how many visible minorities we have? And she said, what do you mean? I said, I have no idea what I mean, but can you just tell me something like that? So there was 29 visible minority, but again, I'm not sure what that means. So what does that mean in our workplace? Well, there are strengths to that, of course, and then there are challenges. The strengths are that, like most nonprofits, we reflect who our client base is. We can create programs and services that respond to our clients before us because we are those people. We are the refugee. We are the internationally educated engineer. We are the person who's really struggled to find a job in Canada because our credentials are not assessed at the level that we think they should be. So we are those people, and many of you will be exactly the same. You know, you do reflect the clients that you work with. It's truly a privilege to work in the organization that I work with. I've been there for 25 years. There are many people who have been there for 20 plus years. It's the not-for-profit sector. You understand that. And ISIS, you know, is a special in our hearts, and it's very difficult to leave once you get there. So those are the strengths. When I asked people around the organization, well, you know, what are our strengths? They were talking about those things, you know, that different cultures. We learn from each other every day. We argue with each other every day. And that's some of the challenges. And then somebody said, lightheartedly, we have the best potlucks, which is true, but on a lighthearted note. But we're not immune to the challenges. We're not immune to the comments like, I'm not a racist. I treat everybody the same. You know, we challenge each other on those statements. The statements, where are you from? How long have you been here? Why did you stay? They're all questions that stop you being a part of Nova Scotia. I was just telling Roger earlier on, I was in a taxi last week on my way to the airport, and the taxi driver said to me, is this your first time in Nova Scotia? I've been here 28 years, and what it does is, you're not really Nova Scotian. I'm really Nova Scotian, but you aren't. So it just cuts you off. And you know, those questions around, you know, is it okay, for instance? I have another colleague in the audience here who's from the UK, and I'm sure she'll have heard this one, is that even people from UK feel it, because is it okay to make fun of my accent, but not okay to make fun of an accent from somebody from Iran or the Cameroons? You know, people make fun of people with Irish accents or English accents. So we challenge each other every day on these sorts of questions. And it makes for a very, very, very lively lunch tables. But we don't let things go. And we were talking earlier as well, you know, I think it's really important to create that space where you can have those conversations without feeling defensive, without just putting your back up, and then you can speak honestly. We have different views, of course, because we come from so many different cultures. We have different views on everything, on politics, on parenting, on you know, the best way to live, you know, our values. But you know, we share those basic values, which is why you work in a not-for-profit organization, and why you work at somewhere like ISIS. So how can we, you know, the lessons learned that we have is never sit back and say, we're the most diverse workplace east of Montreal and we're doing great. You know, we can't sit back and let that happen. We've got to constantly question ourselves, ensuring that each staff person, each volunteer, each client feels that they're included, they're part of it, and that our programs and services reflect that. We also continue to ask employees for their feedback. You know, how are we doing? You know, are we doing okay? You know, can we do anything better? So we continually ask for that feedback from staff. That's been really, really helpful. Some of the things you can change, some of the things you can't change, but at least we're trying to listen. So if you want a more diverse culturally workplace, speak to us. We have, you know, we work with 4,000 immigrants from different cultures every year. So we have registered, working today with 4,000 clients. So we have people who, A, are looking for work, B, who are looking to volunteer. We have special programs that try and match immigrants and refugees with volunteer experience. If you're looking for volunteers, please come and see us, because we're always we're looking for opportunities. And first of all, it's a business case, isn't it? RBC jumped on the bandwagon a long time ago, and if you go into different RBCs in Halifax, you'll see on the front service line the people who reflect that community. You'll see people who speak Mandarin, people who speak Arabic, who speak Spanish. You'll see those faces. They realize, it's a business case. But it's a business case for us as well, I think, because immigrants are not only immigrants, they're just folks, they're just people. We often talk about, when does an immigrant stop being an immigrant and just become a person? A person who can do and can work with you and needs the services that every one of you is providing. It can help to have that diversity culturally, and I'm just talking culturally now, within your organizations, and we can certainly help.
Great, thanks, Joe. Any way you choose to pass that mic.
Thank you. Thank you. Right way. Canada. I just want you to think of that word, Canada. And you've probably seen that vignette on television where you had the Recollet talking to Anita, and she says, come to my village. Well, that's all wrong. Canada is the Orokin word for Gana, place there. Canada, place there. And we have in our great place in Canada 73 nations of Aboriginal peoples. And they're all histories, they have histories and so forth. And in the East Coast, we have the Mi'kmaq, and mostly covering all of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PI, Newfoundland, and parts of Quebec and Maine. And we also have the Maliseet people. In the room here, we have 4 colleagues there, Lee with Spencer and so forth. They're wave. They're Mi'kmaq, and they're here to watch me. I work for Maritime Aboriginal People's Council. It's really not work for, work with. MAPC is a regional body that represents the 3 councils of Aboriginal people who live off reserve, the forgotten people. And I use the term Aboriginal peoples because that's what we are, Mi'kmaq Aboriginal. And the 3 councils have a different role. We're both advocates for change and advocates to allow us to have our dignity. The history of Aboriginal people in Canada is sad history, particularly in this part of the world where we have a 400-year history, 175-year history with the French, where we loved each other, and then a 150-year history with the British or the English, where I guess there's been a conflict, even though there are treaties of peace and friendship. But I wonder if you imagine how it is to be a Mi'kmaq and with Indian policy, with the whole intent of a policy of the federal government, that hasn't changed. It hasn't changed since the colonial ordinances. It's still there. And as the Prime Minister of Canada noted in 2009, we apologize for trying to kill the Indian in the Indian. Now just imagine if someone said that to you, I'm trying to kill the Irish in the Irish. I'm trying to kill the Scots in the Scots. I'm trying to kill the Ukrainian in the Ukrainian. What does that mean? Well, that's what the off-reserve Aboriginal people live with, and on-reserve. But the off-reserve live with another problem, is that they're forgotten and they're told, well, shouldn't somebody be taking care of you? Don't you have a Department of Indian Affairs? Well, if that department is there to destroy you, how can it be taking care of you? And that's the issue. That's why back in 1971, 72, men and women who are seeking help, or seeking a place within this country, within this province, all the provinces in Canada, formed associations and there was nothing else to form. Legally, they have to form, so they form themselves as not-for-profit organizations. But they're really advocates, advocates for change, advocates for a place, advocates for welcoming others to their lands, to their homelands. And that's interesting because you have many, many off-reserve Aboriginal people who go to school, live in hamlets and towns and villages, and are still to this day looked upon as different, looked upon as inferior. Their worth and their merit and their capacity is demeaned, even by the Department of Indian Northern Affairs, even by their brothers and sisters who live on a reserve. And I'm talking about brothers and sisters physically. You'll have a brother living on a reserve and a sister living off reserve who's non-status because of the Indian Act. The challenges have been great. The council itself, by its own bent, working closely with family members all across this province, formed local associations, grouped together, helped each other out, eventually convinced the provincial government to help with some forms of education, helped with housing. All these achievements were basically being pushed upon by the community to the provincial governments to do something for change and to help out. In 1974, the federal government recognized something, and it was known back then, but the federal government recognized it in a document that was top secret, and it was only revealed lately in 2012 in the Daniels case, that a cabinet memo wrote that the off-reserve Aboriginal people in Canada are the most marginalized and discriminated of all peoples in Canada. Now imagine, this is your homeland. Spencer has no other place to go. They won't give him a passport to go anywhere else. Lee has no other place to go. Tracy has no other place to go. This is your homeland, and yet you're marginalized. So how do you think that feels? And so what have we done? Have we achieved a lot? Yeah, I think we have. In the last 35 years, working up north, but working 33 years with the Mi'kmaq, the off-reserve, the native councils in the 3 maritime provinces, women forced to change to the Indian Act in 1985. That was a great, great battle to get rid of 12(1)B, only to be stuck with another piece of carrying on legislation which discriminated against the children, the grandchildren. Well, finally they got Bill C-3, and we're still fighting to get rid of this Indian Act. Canada is one of very few countries in the world that still has an act that demeans and disparages and violates the fundamental human right of identity, birthright identity, that's known as the Indian Act. The association itself doesn't have a lot of funding. We don't have 122 paid employees. We have, though, over 400 volunteers. Each of the 13 zones have their little elected presidents, their chiefs, their secretaries, their treasurers, their ways and means committees, and they help each other. And they form collectively, they join in General Assembly, Annual Assembly, pass resolutions, pass challenges to the federal government, challenges to the provincial government, challenges to themselves. Where are we going? What do we want? It's a hard path. It's a challenging path, but we have moved ahead, I think, slowly. Is discrimination still around? Yes. Does somebody look upon you if you say to them, oh, well, I'm a Mi'kmaq. Oh, you're Indian. Well, I guess so, if you want to call me Indian. Or you're First Nation. Well, if you want to call me First Nation, that's another term for people who are living on a reserve. Well, I don't know. I'll maybe wait. I've had a bad experience with an Indian before. And this is a constant that Aboriginal youth feel. So how do you think you feel? So it is, I don't want to be a downer here, but is there positive sides? Yes, there are some positive things. We've achieved changes. We've moved for changes. We've done a lot of it on our own. We're not alone, though. Aboriginal people, Indigenous people in the world are over 600 million, and we have formed relationships and ties with many Indigenous people around North America and South America, as well as Africa and Asia and so forth. So we do have relationships and contacts with other Indigenous people. Unfortunately, when we work together and try to bring about some changes, when we bring them to Canada, Canada still has, so the federal government still denies the existence of international documents such as the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which is basically only a declaration. It's a human rights document, and yet Canada refuses to accept it, and it says it's an aspirational document, whatever that means. Lately, Canada has refused to acknowledge a totally voluntary document, the guidelines on small fisheries. This affects all of us, and many in this room realize that Nova Scotia is dependent on small fisheries. And it's refused to accept those guidelines for the very simple reason that it allows artisanal fisheries and Aboriginal fisheries. That's the only reason. So, but we'll fight that too. Where can we go ahead from here? Training. We work with everybody to merge and to live together in peace and friendship. Ecocentric worldviews and homocentric worldviews are not that divergent. Diversity is something we should celebrate in this country, because that's what Canada is. I attended a conference many, many years ago, a long, long time ago. I almost forget about it. But the question was asked, why do people come to Canada? Why would anybody want to come to a country that's got 8 months of winter, half a month of spring, half a month of fall, and a bunch of black flies? Why would anybody want to come to this country? And it's interesting. We had a diverse. My goodness, it was everybody. We had Aboriginal people, you name it. We had everybody there from every walk of life. And the solution at the end of it was, people don't really come to Canada. They're squeezed into Canada because of their problems back home, because of certain situations back in their own country. And I said, well, why would they be squeezed? And the result was that they're squeezed because their worth as a human being, the merit that they bring with them, their capacity is demeaned. Their dignity as a person is demeaned. And so they come to a country that they hope will cherish their diversity, cherish their merit, support their worth, their capacity, and their dignity. And that really is what Canada is. It's a place for all of us. We are a pluralistic society, and the sooner the federal government, the provincial governments, politicians, municipal people realize that, the better we're off, the better we'll move ahead and become the strongest nation there is, because we are a pluralistic nation. Canada says it all, a place there. And I'll just cut at that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
It's heavy.
Thank you. You have to. I tend to ramble a little bit. What can I say? When I was asked to sit on the panel, I had to think about the word diversity, because it never really resonated with me in terms of what I had viewed over the past years with diversity training, diversity management, and diversity policies and procedures. And I sometimes still look around and see that many of my community was still unemployed and still experiencing discrimination. So that word never really felt very strong for me. The word inclusion, it has a different meaning for me. I work with the Community Justice Society, and as far as I know, I'm the only African Nova Scotian executive director in the province that is the director of an organization that is predominantly Caucasian, board and staff. Because I've looked around, and maybe if some of you know there's somebody else, I'd like to know about that. So our agency, we work with youth between the ages of 12 and 17, and we try to look at through the lens of who's represented in that organization. We also have a large volunteer component to our organization, and we deliver the Restorative Justice Program, which is the largest program for the Community Justice Society, along with others. So when I came to the organization some 9 years ago, I had to take a look around, and it didn't mean that we didn't have some cultural diversity within the organization, or we didn't hire an immigrant here and there in the organization. But what kind of was missing for me was the whole overview that somehow the position that I had entered into, that I shouldn't have been there. That maybe that was just a little bit too much. That maybe another position would have worked equally as well. So as the executive director, I had to take sort of control to be to present some leadership for my staff and my board. And one of the great things about that, over the last few years in particular, we began to look at through the lens of diversity in a very different way for me. We have a great volunteer program, which is really quite culturally diverse. We work with restorative justice language, which also helps us understand where people are coming from within the organization and community. We also understand that through the restorative justice program, we have adopted those 3 pillars of restorative justice, which is community that we work with, working with victims, and working with offenders. Those same 3 pillars bring to mind how the sector is also located. We have business, we have government, and then we have a nonprofit sector, which I am told is larger than both, if we were to take a look at that across Canada. So when I think about that, I think about how are we using a diversity lens within our nonprofit organizations. The room, I'm sure, does not depict that today. I do not see a lot of visible minorities in the room or visible people. That doesn't mean that they're not here. I'm just looking from my own eyeballs. I don't know how people identify. I don't know if the sector has thoroughly thought about what needs to happen to engage a more diverse population within the sector. We have a lot of nonprofit organizations that is basically African Nova Scotian, that serve African Nova Scotians, particularly on different areas, but we do not have, to my understanding, organizations that particularly deal with opening the doors to a diverse racial landscape for their organization, so that we're building people, we're bringing them in, we're helping to understand what that looks like from a larger perspective. What does your organization look like from a larger perspective? And are you in those positions where you have an opportunity to train those new people who are coming in, who may not be quite as qualified, who may not have the opportunity to even show how well they're qualified? Is there something within your organization where you can lend a hand to say, let's look at what we're really doing here. Let's be deliberate about how we want to diverse our organizations. We say diversity brings a rich culture. Well, if you have no diversity in your organization, and I'm talking specifically around racial diversity at this point, because I know many organizations have a lot of diversity, or some. But racial diversity, I don't see a lot of that in our nonprofit organization to any great extent. I know there's collaboration with Black organizations within the province. I know you come together, you talk about things, but rather we're deliberate to say, we need to look at this from a different lens. Why would we hire an African Nova Scotian male or female or young person? Should we? And if we do, what do we have to offer? And it's not just coming through the doors. It's about looking at who's in your workplace and how do you make a new person, not just a newcomer, but how do you make racial diverse people comfortable in your organization? I remember when I first started working many years ago, we were looking at how women could be integrated within the sector where there was non-traditional jobs for women.
Just more in front of you, so we can, thanks.
Where there was non-traditional jobs for women. And I worked with a group of women who we were looking at, I think DNC somewhere around the dockyards many, many years ago. And we had many of those meetings, and we were told straight up that those jobs were not for women. Those jobs were for people's family. I came through here My son's going to come through here, and that's how this plays out. And I think that's changed over the years. But it came through a lot of discussion, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain in order to change that structure. I really don't think we have to go through that again in this society. Diversity, as people said, is more than a language. It's more than race. It's more than color. It's more than your disability or whatever. But it's about an attitude and a deliberate way to really understand and build relationships with people. And we start one-on-one. That's difficult sometimes. And we're always sometimes afraid that somebody is going to put us down. When I came to this job, it was very, very difficult. But I guess maybe sometimes I think I may be stronger than the average bear, that I had to stand my ground to say, I am just as important as anybody else that walks through the store. And I've had a lot of experience in the African Nova Scotian community, working on boards and organizations. Every room that I walk into that is outside of the African Nova Scotian community, usually I'm the only one. And sometimes I think somebody must have a list and says, call Yvonne Atwell if you need somebody to come to the table, and she'll come. And now I say I come for a price. So if you're going to pay me, I'll come. But in all honesty, if there's not a deliberate move towards, for me, cultural diversity, if there's not a deliberate move to have those deep conversations and sit there and take the heat, and cry and feel bad and in the end feel good, then there's no point of us having this kind of conversation. The Community Justice Society, our staff is unionized, part of our staff. And it's a fairly new organization, fairly new union. It's only about 6 years old. So when people came on board, within the policy of that union, we wrote in the fact that we had to have representation of young people that came through this organization. And therefore, an African Nova Scotian must be part of that collective agreement where you cannot move that out of your articles. It's entrenched in the union negotiations. It's to guarantee that if we only get one or two, we only get one or two, but at least we know we will do that. We'll look for that. The other thing that we can do in terms of employment, and if you're looking at racial diversity, is to seek people out, to go looking for folks, not just an ad on, wherever you put your ads, but to actually look around and say, let me find out who's out there. Let's take a look and actually sort of hid hunt in a way to at least bring people into your organization where you can have that conversation, whether you hire them or not. But at least it's a deliberate attempt to say, well, I put out an ad and nobody came. That's not good enough anymore. Because as you can see, many of them, and we have many black organizations, but I don't see, I really can't see anybody here today that I would say, okay, you're from the East Preston Right Praise Association, or you're from the Recreation Center, or you're from another nonprofit organization to come and talk today. I don't see that, and that disturbs me a little bit. So we're not doing enough, and I put myself in this as well, right? I live in these communities as well. I have these hard conversations, and sometimes I don't want to hear them as well. So I always put myself there. But when you start to have those restorative conversations where you can be honest and open and say, I don't know anything, but I want you to help me understand what I don't know. I think that would begin a very positive conversation around how do we deliberately open up our organizations to include all diversity, but for me, racial diversity. Because I know what it does when somebody has a good job and is able to go to work every day and feed their families. I know it has, I've watched people transform their lives, even their face will transform. So it's really important that if we're looking at social justice issues as nonprofit organizations, that we have to have that on our radar. Thank you.
There's a second mic thing. You don't have to take it off, you can leave it on that, so you don't have to hold it off.
So is that working? Yes? Okay. I come from a storytelling culture, and so I'll be framing my thoughts around some stories, and the first one will be a borrowed story, moving into a personal story, and then fanning out again into a story that was shared with me. Because most of my work in my adult life has been in creating dialogue and agreement between groups who would rather not talk to each other and who believe that agreement is no longer possible. Those are the kinds of things that I'll be talking about. So I'll start with a borrowed story. A young girl captured a small bird, held it in her hands behind her back, and went to the sage to ask the most difficult of questions. She wanted to trick the sage by asking if the bird was dead or alive. If the sage said the bird was alive, she would squeeze it to death behind her back in her hands. If the sage said the bird was dead, then she would present the live bird. So upon approaching the sage, she asked if the bird was alive or dead. And the sage simply responded, "It is in your hands." So I'd like to extrapolate from that some of the lessons that I've learned over the decades. And the first lesson is avoid trickery. Do not come to the table with the bird behind your back, the bird representing the life of another culture. Don't wield power unnecessarily just because you have it in the palm of your hand, because you may be surprised what birds are being held behind the back of the other party, and it may not be what you expect. The second lesson is considering what you may be damaging in the future that cannot be undone. You might prove you're clever, but you'll also prove that you are without honor. People never forget a death, whether it's a death of a culture, a death of a language, death of a child or an elder, or the death of their ancestors. So death is a very profound thing to do to another culture. If I came to you and said, yes, I've stolen your children and I've educated them into something you don't recognize, and I've taken your language and your voice, and I've confined you in a geographic area where you have no opportunity to live your being and your spirit as you know it to be. But now I'd like to be friends. And now you can trust me. And now we're going to talk. It isn't very likely that you're going to feel disposed to believe what I have to say. And so you have to know that people bring their stories to the table and they interpret what you say based on their history. And be mindful of that. The third lesson is that people hear you through the lens of their history. And if at some time you've crushed the bird when you cradled it in your hands, you've taught somebody who you are. And it's very hard to undo that lesson, and that works both ways. The fourth lesson is that people are whole before they were you. One of my frustrations recently is hearing all the time, I'm so excited what the Aboriginal community is doing now with all kinds of entrepreneurship. I would just once love to hear somebody say, I'm so excited about traditional Aboriginal culture and the social safety net and their methods of education and their sense of democracy and their governance and their sustainable housing policy. That would be really wonderful to hear. And remembering and recognizing that there was something valuable there before that became who we recognize, which is us. The other aspect of that is I can remember an elder telling me a story that I never forgot. And he was talking about children being removed from a home, an Aboriginal home, because the home was dirty. And the question he asked was, who did that bother, the social worker or the child? And I never forgot the message of that. As different cultures, we have completely different ideas about child rearing, about when children should be potty trained, about the importance of intuition as opposed to science, or even what science is, about when and how emotions are expressed. We tend to, in the Western world, categorize emotions as a pathology. We have a name for it all and a pill for most of it. But that is not necessarily the way that it should be or the way that it is for other cultures. The fifth lesson is that what you hold in your hands is the delicacy of life. That's what that bird is. And the amazing thing about life is that we get to choose what kind of life we're going to create. Ultimately, the question isn't what's happened in the past, but what are we going to build from here? That life is a very fragile life, and ideally, both sides will hold it in their hands together and nourish it and allow it to grow. I promised I'd talk about the bridge. So I'll just say a few things about that. the bridge has sort of become a cliche. You know, we're going to build bridges between cultures. And so some of the things that I would like you to think about is, A, the purpose of that bridge. Is it being built for the purposes of warfare, so you can cross into another culture and do harm? Is it being built temporarily for your own purposes? Is it being built permanently so that two cultures can continually cross that bridge? Is there a toll on either side? Is one side resourced more than another side? Has it been built with the intention of maintaining it, and how is it going to be maintained, and with what resources and for what purpose? And the bridge should be the beginning and not the end. And I see so much of this. We built a bridge, you know, as if that is somehow the accomplishment. And it isn't the accomplishment, it's just the start. And I'd like to end with a story that was related to me. Yesterday we heard from the One Nova Scotia Commission, or some people who were involved in the One Nova Scotia Commission. And I want to call it the One Nova Scotia Commission and not the Ivany Report, because it was never meant to be the Ivany Report. It was meant to be a report that was gathered from the voices of people in Nova Scotia from diverse backgrounds and geographic locations. So that's what I'd like to call it. At the same time as that commission was going on, I was doing a study on rural libraries in Nova Scotia. And we didn't have the same amount of money, so it was me and my little red PT Cruiser driving all around the province and gathering stories, not only from boards and librarians and staff, but from people who use libraries. And there was one meeting and one woman, although there were many beautiful stories. We collected more than 150 of them in total from diverse groups. But one that stayed with me was a woman from a country near India who had come to Canada. And the library, I must say, is the place where that first point of contact tends to occur for a lot of new Canadians. So that's where they go to learn literacy, to learn the culture, to connect with other people, to find out what the laws and rules are, to engage in programs and receive supports. And we tend to put libraries in buildings that the community no longer is using and doesn't want, and we tend to underfund them. But she had come to this public consultation meeting, and she had dressed up beautifully in the best of her clothes to come and tell her story. And she talked about how when she arrived here as a woman with two small children at home, and her husband was a professor trying to make his career, how isolating that was for her. And she joined a knitting club at the library, and she was allowed to bring her two small children. And that's how she made friendships, and that's how she learned to navigate the culture. And the things that they were afraid of doing their taxes because they didn't know if they did them wrong, could they be imprisoned? It was very confusing. There were reams and reams of forms that were hard to understand, and the library was the place they went for help. And she said in her country, libraries are available if you are attending an academic institution at a post-secondary level, but they're not public libraries that are publicly available to all people. So one of my pleas would be to support the institutions that support the safe places for dialogue, that are the points of contact for diverse cultures, and the people who are working in them who are so under-resourced. Never forgot her story, and how important it was to her to come and tell that story. So important that she got dressed up for the occasion to come and speak. So that's probably all I have to share, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Good evening or good afternoon. It's great to be here. I've really enjoyed the time with all of you. Very diverse group as I look from where I am right now. So I represent the Health Association of African Canadians, which has really been in existence for about 14 years. So I'll tell you a little bit about the organization, and then just a little bit about the community and the issue of diversity. So, you know, I'm coming to you here kind of off the cuff, if you will. And basically, the Health Association grew out of a need in the community. We're very focused on health issues in the Black community. And as our mission, we talk about improving and promoting the health of African Canadians living in Nova Scotia. And there are many challenges that our community has. And some of the challenges stem from the fact that we need to have a culturally specific approach to issues that affect our health. So, for instance, when you talk about death and dying in our culture, when a relative, a grandparent, or somebody is unwell and is approaching the end of life, then as part of our culture, which is a part of many other cultures as well, we tend not to rush them off to hospital, but we tend to care for them in the home. And are there supports to help an individual household to do that? You'll have a mom, maybe she's, say, 55 years of age, who is busy looking after her family and has not been to see a healthcare provider for many years. She feels okay, but she could have high blood pressure and not know it. There are many chronic diseases that affect our community, and one of the challenges is not only to help people in the community to identify any chronic illnesses they may have, but how to prevent those things. So if I go out and I say, you know, if you eat healthy and you exercise, that will prevent you from developing diabetes. But then eating healthy, as we all know, costs money. And is there the financial means for many people in the community to be able to buy what we call healthy food? So there are many challenges, and as I said, we're focused as an organization on the health issues of our Black community. And we believe very much in partnerships. And one of the things I've said to Kathleen here is that this type of proceeding, of workshop where we all come together, is a kind of a great springboard to finding ways that we can work together, that we can understand each other. Because when you talk about diversity, cultural diversity, you know, when we talk about cultural competence, it's basically about understanding the way that we work as a culture, as a population, and how we can work together, going back to the analogy of a bridge. So we've done several things, and one of the things I'd highlight for you, I don't know how many of you were aware of the visit of Dr. Williams in February, who is an expert on mental health and racism. And he came up and we had an event actually right here in this room, which was live streamed as well. And we worked with Cancer Care Nova Scotia, Capital Health, Dalhousie, Department of the Faculty of Medicine, Department of Health and Wellness. And we put on this event and it really worked very well. He gave a number of presentations to different groups. And, you know, it was an event that we were really, it showcased the issue of working together. And so I think partnerships are the way to go. As an organization, we're relatively small compared with many others, and we're not going to be able to do it alone. And so my message really in this time is for us to look for ways that we can work together. The plenary we had yesterday about the One Nova Scotia Commission was intended to get us talking about that issue, because I am of the belief myself that this group is where it's at. You know, we can look to government, we can look to business, but we all know that we're working away and doing things in our communities which make a difference. And I think if we put ourselves together, if we work together, we'll be such a powerful force for change. And that is really what we need. We recognize, that's why we're having this plenary, we recognize that there is cultural diversity amongst us, and we need to build those bridges to each other so that we can use the leverage that we can bring to bear. And that's what I have to say right now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Grab this mic. I'll grab this one. Okay.
Thank you very much, panelists. So on the time that we have left, and we have about 15 or 20 minutes left, I think I'll pick up on what David was saying at the end of his contribution. We did set the tone, and in some ways, the topic of the 2 days by running the first plenary around the subject of this occasion of the release of the One Nova Scotia manifesto, I'll call it. And as a sector, are we in a position, should we make try to build ourselves up to the point where we can model and lead and facilitate and deliver on or broker these other sectors so that we can fulfill that challenge of collaboration, of greater innovation and collaboration? Do we have the cred for that? Maybe not at this point. What are some of the strategic moves we can make? What are some successes that we can emulate to get us to the point where in our own organizations and as a sector, we can be the lead on making Nova Scotia a more welcoming, rich and diverse and inclusive place so that we can be a more viable place? Questions, advice, asking for advice? Yeah.
Sorry if I was just for the live stream.
Yeah, who's first? And then we'll pass.
Go behind you.
Thank you so much. My name's Eliza Fernbach, and I'm the Vice President of Visual Arts Nova Scotia, and I have been so enriched so far by being here and listening. I strive for excellence in my existence in the world as a fellow with other people. I identify as a black man. I identify as a little old white lady. I see myself, and I feel myself, and I feel the similarities. And I had the courage to say that today because of listening to the courage from the panel. I worked very hard to apply to Harvard University, and when it came to my interview, I was told that I was an excellent candidate, but I would have had a much better chance if I was a lesbian black war veteran. It's time to stop talking about diversity and how different we are and how we have to understand each other, and just start being excellent together. I see the excellence in other human beings, and it breaks my heart when I see other human beings not recognizing their own excellence. I came to Nova Scotia to follow my heart, and my heart has been broken here to see people who don't understand how fantastic they are. Let's stop talking about how different we are and how we need to understand each other, and start being excellent.
Any responses are welcome, or let's stand.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to say that I have no idea what it feels like to be a white woman or a black man. But that doesn't mean I don't want to understand their story or their experience so that I can be a better person and they can understand their excellence. But whenever I try to be somebody else, that's when it becomes a problem. But I do understand what you're saying.
I think that took a lot of courage for you to say that, and I applaud you for that, because I think it's, for many of us, that's difficult to understand. But I think that's what I was trying to say with, when does an immigrant stop being an immigrant? Like, they're just folks, they're just people, and it can be frustrating that we put labels on people. We put labels, multiple labels on people, and we deal with people because of that label. So thank you.
We have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question.
Or comment. Sorry.
People probably remember yesterday when Rankin McSween was talking about how he feels like there's an incredible potential in our sector, and he used the word that we're a sector on the margins. And I just wanted to address that for a minute, because that's always been what's inspired me about our sector, and even beyond it. when you're studying biology, they talk about margins being the places, for example, at the edge of a meadow and a forest. That's where the greatest diversity is biologically. That's where all the change happens, is at the margins, right? And when I got involved with this sector, I think that was kind of my sense of feeling at home, was it being part of the sector. Now, I think, though, that what I feel today in this conversation is that we could just become a whole lot better margin by starting to really incorporate all of those people out there on the margins and becoming more diverse and becoming just more interesting, to go with what Mark was saying yesterday about how we're sometimes a bit boring. But I really think that we serve, I know that we serve the most vulnerable people in this province. That's what our sector does. But I think we need to start thinking about ourselves as beyond just the institutions, beyond just the organizations, and into the community. Like, Yvonne was talking about all those organizations who are out there or in any other community that don't even identify yet as a nonprofit. They don't even have a registration with joint stocks. But they're doing all that incredible work of making those connections and taking care of other people and themselves in the community. So I think that this sector needs to start feeling like we are part of the leadership of that whole marginalized, and if you have any doubts, you just have to look at the budgets lately, but the whole marginalized sector that has got great power and great potential power.
Thank you. My name's Kim, and I'm involved with the Deanery Project on the Eastern Shore. And I just would like to ask the panel and people in the room to think about place and how we can create place as a way, as a means to reach some of the goals that we're all trying to achieve. And if we don't think about reclaiming, reanimating the spaces that we are been so disenfranchised from and that exist in all of our communities, I'm wondering how we can get to that. We're involved in an experiment to look at our rural communities and to invite people into a space where many, many people can experience buildings, land, and livelihood in ways that enrich them and expose them to new ways and old ways of thinking. And I'm just curious about the experience of the panelists of what, where they've seen that happen and how we can go wade more deeply and more quickly into that world.
I don't know if I have the answer, but it's interesting. We, at lunchtime, talked about that whole area about space. That if we find the space every minute of our days, even if you find it in a grocery store, in an aisle, and talk to each other. As I said to the group here, it takes me 4 hours to do my shopping because I'm forever stopping and talking, and the aisles aren't wide enough for 2 carts. But I think space is, you've hit it on the nail there. We don't give ourselves that space, that time. And I think if we do that every day as an exercise, emotional, mental, and physical, I think it's the capacity, our merit, and our worth, and our dignity will grow with those around us. I think that's what we do need, this space.
I'm struggling a little bit with the question, and I'll explain why. Because I wish that I could say something profound that was a solution. And I don't think I have that solution. But what I do have is an observation. I think that we're afraid sometimes to share space. And we talk about welcoming people into the space of Nova Scotia, but we have a fear that they might have different customs or different beliefs or different ways of doing things, or they may value things differently than we do, or they might change the rules or bring in new rules and new ideas. And that can be a little scary. But the other thing that I'm struggling with is how we define space between people and the ways in which we confine people to spaces that we are comfortable with them being in. So if I can borrow from the Mi'kmaq experience and First Nation experience across the country of being confined to a space that was unfamiliar, and that the intent of that space was to annihilate a people, And to leave that space was something that had penalties that were very serious. I just came from a conference in Ontario about women's wellness, and some of those women were sharing their stories of having to wait until the Indian agents were asleep so they could go out to their traditional places and celebrate traditional stories and traditional songs, because they weren't allowed to get permission to leave the reserve to go to those places and engage in those traditional practices. Sometimes those boundaries are geographic boundaries like that we draw around people, and sometimes they're invisible boundaries where we keep people in their place. And that can be by gender, and it can be by ethnicity, and by race, and by culture. So if we broaden our definition of place and then begin to talk and have some of those dialogues about how we make all places safe for all people to be, then I think that's a richer place to be.
Sorry, were you going to comment? Mine is a comment or an observation, and to your point, Jerry, about asking people where they came from, and I'm not going to ask people for a show of hands, but how many people in this room are the children of immigrants? How many removed? And I don't necessarily find the question, where are you from, one that limits, providing it's genuine curiosity, opening to a dialogue to learn more. What I find interesting in my own family, because I'm first-generation Canadian on my mother's side, and I'm third on my father's, and not everybody in my family spoke English. What I find really interesting is a sense of entitlement that I see in some members of my family who immigrated here. And it starts with a real passion. My mother was passionate about this country. Her centennial project in 1967 was to get her citizenship, and my brother 2 years before that. But they came from war, and my mother loved this country, learned as much as she could, probably knew more about it than I learned in history in school. But I find that certain things, xenophobic comments that are circulated in emails and on Facebook, and some from members of my own family, who, why can't people speak English? That should be a requirement before you come into this country. And my response always back, good thing Grandpapa didn't have to speak English, because he didn't speak English till he died at 93. Well, not until he died. He didn't learn to speak English when he died, but you know what I mean. A sudden revelation. He converted. But we want people who come to this country, they choose this country, and that's a difference for me, having been born here. I take it for granted. And when people come to this country, it's a choice. They have a love for it, they have a passion, they have a curiosity that perhaps some of us who were privileged to have been born here don't have. And so when we ask people where they're from, I think we need to understand where our question's coming from and what it is we want to know.
We have time for a few more and a comment from Jerry.
I agree. I think what's important, though, is that you create the space to be able to ask that question and to challenge somebody on. Why are you asking me that question?
Yeah, hi. I'm Spencer Volman from, I'm a Mi'kmaq, and I'm first generation Canadian, or whatever you want to call it. I'm from Wamakuk, and it's in Cape Breton, and so sometimes I'm identified as a Cape Bretoner. So anyway, going to school, my first language was Mi'kmaq. And I could tell you another story of how I lost my language, but that's another thing. The Ivany report and Yvonne's comments about seeing people in the audience, seeing herself. The education system is another thing. We still don't see the Mi'kmaq in the curriculum. Employment equity. We don't see ourselves in the school system. There's approximately 10,000 teachers in Nova Scotia. Cumberland Central, the school board. There's 50 teachers are going to retire. 32 are going to be rehired. Probably 0 Mi'kmaq teachers will be hired. I'm quite certain it'll be 0. And if we fight hard enough, maybe we get 1. But I'm still quite certain we're not going to see Mi'kmaq faces in the classroom, teaching. We ask our Mi'kmaq students to feel proud of themselves, but it's hard to feel proud of yourselves when you don't see yourself as teachers, principals, or custodians, whatever. That's the same thing in the law, lawyers. That's the same thing in most professions. So I heard that word I heard one word yesterday from a panelist. She talked briefly on racism. We need the employers to have a better understanding of the makeup of Nova Scotia. And it'd be nice, everybody's looking for work, but, we were the first here. We should have first crack at it. And, I hear the comments about, the immigrants coming here who don't have the first language is English. We have a lot of First Nations whose first language isn't English. Telling the school boards, the Department of Education, that language as a second, English as a second language should be offered to First Nation students, because their language, in a lot of cases, isn't first. They're English. I have a hard time with the English language sometimes, because I was probably 8 years old, 9 years old when I started learning the English language in school. And that was only 50-some years ago. And so, there's not too many, diversity here from the First Nations here, from the Mi'kmaq here, from the African Nova Scotian. That's just to name 2 cultures. I mean, there's it seems like, when our panelists is up here is, you all know, we're looking for answers, and hopefully we can find some. Thank you.
Yeah, just maybe one more, and then we'll wrap.
Hi. My name is Lisa Roberts. I work for a group called the North End Community Circle, but really Yvonne is my boss, for which I'm very grateful, because it's a project that she has shepherded along and sought funding for. I just wanted to make a comment about I think two different and simultaneous approaches that we have to take when looking to work and encourage real diversity and a real sense of welcome and a real sense of belonging in our communities. One of the speakers talked about immigrants arriving here because they've been squeezed out, and I think as an adopted Nova Scotian, I grew up in Newfoundland mom from Newfoundland, whatever. So I wasn't born in Nova Scotia. So if people ask who my father is, they don't care about the answer because it's irrelevant to them. But I think many immigrants arrive here because they were squeezed out in some ways by history. I mean, that is the history of immigration, is of old history and often conflict squeezing people out, and therefore they go and they seek sort of like a place to start fresh, where those particular tensions and conflicts and history don't impact them. But I think we have to be mindful that in Nova Scotia, for African Nova Scotians and for Mi'kmaq people and First Nations or Aboriginal Canadians in general, this is where a lot of the history happened. And so we can't just say, let's just be open, or let's just be welcoming, without also kind of learning some of the history that is really recent and people are still living it in their second generation. You know, in many cases, people I'm interacting with in the North End of Halifax they have their own lived experiences of that, and their parents have their own lived experiences of that. So I think we have to do both. I think we have to both look towards a future where we're open and welcoming, and people can arrive and not take 3 generations to feel like they belong here. But also we have to be aware that there are people here who have many more than 3 generations here already and who experienced real racism and discrimination, and that's also shaped how they feel about how they belong here.
Any final comments, folks? Final comments? We'll wrap. Okay. Is it short?
Well, thank you all very much for taking this time to consider the conversation we've had and participate in it. We're very passionate, many of us, most of us, about our communities and about this place that we call Nova Scotia and this common community. I think we can be so much better, and we can make a place that is far richer and more viable and wealthier in the fullest sense by embracing diversity and by thinking really carefully about some of the hard questions, finding the spaces to pose these questions to ourselves and each other and reach out. So I really appreciate, and I want to express the gratitude of the organizers and the group here. Not only that you've taken the time today to come and share with us your perspectives, but clearly for your own passion and community building in the work that you do and the value-driven work that you do. So thank you very much for your interesting contributions today, folks.